Right now, let's put the question I'm putting to you to my next guest. He's Daniel Di Martino. He's a fellow at the Manhattan Institute in the States and an exile from Venezuela. And he joins us to talk about, well, what's really been going on. A very good afternoon to you, Daniel.
Very good afternoon to you.
Thank you very much indeed for joining us. I'll put the question I'm putting to our audience. Was Donald Trump right or wrong to launch that military raid to arrest the leader, Nicolas Maduro, and his wife?
Yes, I woke up, it was an early morning for me, not because of the news. I just slept early. I woke up early at 6 a.m. local time, and my phone was ringing like crazy, everybody telling me the news. And I'm like, what is going on? Somebody died? What did I do? I don't know what's happening. And then I learned about the news of Maduro being captured, and it's like a dream for me as a Venezuelan. And I think that that's the same reaction for millions of people. People are dancing in the streets all over the world, celebrating. So how can somebody in a different country tell us, oh no, this is so wrong? Maduro is an indicted drug trafficker. Countries conduct police operations abroad all the time.
Yeah, it's very interesting, the contrast between, particularly on the left around the world, saying how terrible and outrageous this is, and the actual Venezuelan people, who, as we know, 80% of Venezuelans voted for the opposition last time round. And we know that 8 million of a very small country had left, like you, to seek a better life abroad. I'd like to go back a little bit and get a little bit of background from you. I mean, you go around, you give talks at universities and everywhere. You're an economist by trade, basically explaining to people about, why we should learn the lessons of Venezuela. I mean, Maduro's learning the lessons and will in a court later today in Manhattan. But why the world, America and Britain included, need to learn the lessons of Venezuela. Tell us what happened under, well, first Chavez and then Maduro, and why you chose to leave.
Yes, so what's important about Venezuela is that unlike every other socialist country, it became socialist democratically. You see, the Eastern Europe didn't become socialist because the Eastern Europeans voted for it. The Russians didn't vote for Lenin either in 1917. The Chinese didn't elect Mao. The Cubans didn't elect Castro.
Yeah.
But the Venezuelans elected Hugo Chavez. And that original sin of voting for him then became a forced regime, right? They began cheating on the elections after their socialist policies became unpopular, but they got in democratically. And it matters because that's what could happen to us in the rest of the democratic world. That's what could happen to the United Kingdom. I mean, it's slowly happening with the rise of government, after the end of the Thatcher years. I'm a big admirer of Margaret Thatcher since I was a very young kid because she stood for free enterprise, and free enterprise is what brings prosperity to a people. In Venezuela, I had to line up for my own food. I had to, have no power for hours. I had to bring water in buckets up to my apartment. And we didn't used to live that way, which is what matters.
That's the thing. Let's go back to before Chavez and Maduro. And people often talk about Maduro as if he's very different from what Chavez did. He's not. I mean, he's just carrying on, just a worse version of what was already bad. But the Venezuelan people, I mean, they were living in one of the richest economies in the world, these vast oil supplies. Everything was going absolutely brilliantly. Why did they then vote for socialism? I mean, because normally we see that, as you say, it's something that's imposed or something that desperate people who are living in poverty might choose.
So, well, there's two factors. One is a short-term one. Venezuela had a banking crisis in the late 90s. There was a recession. There were corruption scandals of the previous government. And Chavez was just a very charismatic politician that capitalized on that, deceived people, they voted for him, and that's how he got elected. But Venezuela had nationalized the oil industry in the 70s. And since he nationalized the oil industry, production stagnated. They tried to backtrack and bring back the private sector in the 90s, but it was too late. The recession happened and Chavez got elected. But you are right. Even then, even though Venezuela was undergoing some issues, it was still the richest country in Latin America. Yeah. It did not have this massive inequality that people claim was the reason they got elected. It was actually less unequal than most other Latin American countries. So these are all excuses. People just got lied to. And that's very easy with charismatic people.
Yeah, indeed. And Maduro, when Chavez died, Maduro took over and he basically made things even worse, because we're not just talking about the incompetence of socialism and these vast oil supplies, which, because the government was now running the extraction process, were basically, wasn't there a point where basically it would cost them 10 times as much to get a barrel of oil out of the ground as any other country? So they lost money on oil production.
And the thing, Julie, is that if socialism was going to work somewhere, it would be in the country that has the largest oil reserves in the world, with free money coming from the ground. And it didn't. It was still not enough money.
Yeah, very fair point. But then we added to that, we saw for the Venezuelans sort of vast corruption, which always goes hand in hand with socialism, interestingly, because of the incompetence, but vast corruption and also drug running. These are the, look, we know this is what, Donald Trump is indicting him on, narco-terrorism conspiracy, cocaine trafficking. How involved was Maduro and his wife, as far as you're aware, and his government with the drug trafficking?
They are a cartel, because after they destroyed the oil industry, they couldn't profit anymore from the oil, right? The oil was government run, the government destroyed it. But you know what was not government run? Drug trafficking. That is certainly privately run and everything, very capitalist in a way. And they were capitalists in their personal level, even though they wanted socialism for the rest of us.
Funny that, yeah.
And so that's how they made money. They paid off their interest. Look, it goes so deep that Maduro's own nephews, the biological nephews of Celia, the wife, were arrested and indicted and then convicted of drug trafficking to the United States. The problem was that Joe Biden, the previous president, he gave them a pardon and sent them back to Venezuela. A big mistake.
Why?
Well, he wanted to exchange them for some American prisoners in Venezuela. Okay. And then Maduro ended up kidnapping more Americans.
Yeah, with this, we've heard so much more about what's gone on with Colombia as well. And Donald Trump has said that Colombia's next on the list. We'll come on to Greenland in a moment. But I mean, has Venezuela been flooding America with drugs? How big an issue is it?
So it's been mainly cocaine, but the issue is that a lot of people say, well, it's all the Mexican cartels. But where do you think the Mexican cartels get their cocaine from? It's produced in Colombia, and then it's transported through Venezuela with Venezuelan state-owned resources. Boats, little airplanes that fly all over to Central America. I mean, there's been many analyses and studies of this that prove that the Center for Strategic and International Studies has a really great map of this. That is how most of the cocaine gets to Europe too, by the way, not just the United States. Spain, the corruption schemes that are happening with Venezuela, and that now we will begin to uncover. Because remember, Maduro is going to give information now to the US government. And a lot of people abroad, I think, should be very scared, because we're going to know everything they did.
Well, this is the thing, isn't it? Because there was a lot of talk on Saturday when we found out that he'd been seized, in that Truth Social post from Donald Trump saying he'd been captured. Extraordinary revelation. But actually, this was all a bit of a farce, because actually he'd done a deal to get out of the country, and he would have been offered the usual. You can keep a certain number of billions, and you go off at your Caribbean island, or head to Moscow, as they often end up doing, and you'll be fine. But it doesn't sound like a deal has been done. But would you expect that one will now be done if he's facing the rest of his life behind bars?
Well, I think the main priority of the administration first is freedom for Venezuela and prosperity, right? Yeah. Especially for the oil industry. You cannot have oil companies invest in Venezuela, because they simply won't, unless there's stability and a democratic government that guarantees that after Trump leaves office, they're not just going to take all their property again. Right? So this is why I think they're threatening Delcy Rodriguez so much. And I think that's a good thing.
She's Maduro's vice president.
Yes. And by the way, she has a long history of violence and Marxism. Her father was a Marxist guerrilla terrorist who got killed in the 70s after he kidnapped an American CEO for 3 years.
Wow.
I mean, this woman was raised by another psychopath.
Right. So this thing, a lot of people are very concerned about, why did Donald Trump leave the Maduro, and his acolytes in power with the support of the military? Why did he not say, we're handing over power to the party that did actually win the last elections, to the opposition?
Yeah, I think the answer is pretty simple. Number one, I mean, this operation was very difficult. Imagine having done it to capture about 5 more people. Americans would have died. almost certainly, in that complex of an operation. Number two, this already gives them the signal, and they already were threatened, and they can do it again one by one. And now they have the chance to do an orderly transition. The military does not support the population, Julia. Yeah. This is important that people understand. The military are the drug dealers. This is not like other Latin American countries where you have the military that are, they're just standing by and judging who they're going to support. No, the soldiers, the low-level soldiers that escaped, they're not defending Maduro. Mm-hmm. Only the Cubans were. The people who ended up getting killed in the raid, 32 were Cubans, the Cuban government already announced. So, but all the generals, all the lieutenants, all of them are drug traffickers. And I think Trump prefers an orderly and stable transition.
Yeah, and we've certainly seen America and the West generally don't have a very strong track record when it comes to this idea of nation building after they've toppled leaders. What do you think happens next? And what are the people back home? I know you've still got your family back in Venezuela, I assume. And what do they want to happen next? Because we've seen, there've been some sort of protests and counter-protests, some people dancing on the streets, but there will be people who've been on the Maduro payroll for a very long time who don't want things to change. Well,
this is important for, I think, every viewer to understand. The overwhelming majority of Venezuelans want the regime out. They're scared of protesting in Venezuela because the armed groups are still around. They're actually crossing all over the streets, Maduro's armed groups, threatening people so that everybody stays home. So what people want is freedom. They want Venezuela to be what it used to be. Julia, my own grandparents immigrated to Venezuela in the 1950s from Italy and Spain because they were poorer in Italy and Spain than in Venezuela. And they found freedom, they found prosperity. We lived a normal life with a car, with a home, going to school, having food, and then no electricity, and then no water. People just want to go back to what it can be. And that's not just good for us. We would stop exporting drugs and illegal immigrants and start welcoming immigrants and exporting oil. Wouldn't that be a beautiful thing for the world?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, what do you make of all the critics in America, in Europe, and others? I mean, we've got Labour MPs and senior figures here in the UK saying, look, this is against the rules-based international order. It's a breach of international law, and this sets a precedent for any dictator, anyone in the world. They can just go and do what they want. You're laughing. What's your response?
Well, because I gotta be very honest. I do not care about the rules. I care about what's just and what's right. And President Trump did what's right for the Venezuelan people, for the American people, and honestly for the world. And if you're against that because of some president, do you think Putin cares about presidents? Exactly. He's out there poisoning his opponents. He's interfering in other elections. He's not going to stop doing that because of what we do or not do. If anything, this sends them a signal that you're on notice. This is what we can do, and do not mess with the free world.
Well, there's a lot of people saying, again, presidents being open, Colombia may be next, Denmark next. There have been some threats, even, Iran. We've had 9 days of protests against the Iranian regime and very clear signals from the American government saying, look, don't start shooting protesters because we will be taking action. Now, we've already seen some people shot in Iran. Yes. Do you think this is America reasserting itself as the world's policeman? In which case, is that a good thing?
Well, it is reasserting itself as in it's going to use its power to advance its interest abroad, not some abstract notions. And by the way, I'm fully endorsing what Trump is threatening to Colombia. The Colombian government is totally in cahoots with Maduro, and Petro is very fearful of what will be revealed in Venezuela because his campaign, the reason he's president of Colombia is the Venezuelan regime. And there's a long history that I think people should research there. So I think that Marco Rubio understands that they really care especially about the Western Hemisphere.
Yeah, that's the thing. This is, the American sphere of influence, isn't it? There is this argument that, that people can talk about this international rules-based order, but it's all just a mirage, and actually it's all about power. Yeah. It's all about what your willingness and your ability to actually use that power. Donald Trump has made that clear. What do you think the future will be for Venezuela? And would you consider going back if it did once again, start booming?
I see two scenarios. One, a positive one, that is there's a transition in the next few months and then the country begins to be rebuilt. And if that happens, of course, I would love to go and help. And I'm very close to, the people who are trying to achieve that. But I do think there's still this scenario where the Trump administration may be deceived by the current regime, as in delaying the transition enough that Trump is out of office and then they stay in power and nothing changes. So that is my concern.
Very interesting. Really
Thank you for
fascinating.
having me,
Well,
Julia.
thank you so much for joining us. I so appreciate that. That is Daniel Di Martino. He's a fellow at the Manhattan Institute in exile from Venezuela. Sam Armstrong, listening to all of that. It is absolutely fascinating, again, how little the media in the West has covered, just the levels of degradation that the Venezuelan people have been pushed to, the fact that it is the biggest single refugee crisis in the world. We don't hear about this in the media. The fact that people resorted to having to, eat their own pets, scrabble for food on the street. Middle-class families living a normal life who had their homes, their farms, their shops seized by the authorities.
I'm sorry to say this as stridently as I do, but it doesn't matter because Maduro wasn't Jewish. I mean, that's the reality. That's the reality. The West has decided that there is only one group that is committing human rights abuses in their view, and that's the only Jewish country on earth. And we hear endlessly and just incessantly about the latest supposed outrage, most of which later turn out to be total and utter falsehoods. But it doesn't matter because it's spread halfway around the world before the truth has got its trousers on. And shame on the broadcast producers, shame on the newspapers, shame on everybody that ignores the plight of 8 million refugees from Venezuela and talks incessantly about one country just as part of their own flagrant, brazen anti-Semitism.
Absolutely. Just to let you know, Nicolas Maduro has now set off from the detention facility in Brooklyn, I think, where he's being held, taking him to a court in Manhattan. He's due to make an appearance at the federal court in Manhattan, 5 o'clock UK time today.